Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. So another week, another prize. The book prize season is very much starting early this year. We're not that far away from the International Booker either. But the first another one that's kind of has been popping up recently, is the Writers' Prize, and this is in some ways a new old prize. It's a renaming of a prize that basically already existed, which is the Writers' Prize, formerly the Rathbone Folio, and it's a prize that I'd been following for a few years and had really been enjoying. The Rathbones Folio sort of is slightly different in that there's a slightly more writerly focus. It's almost an attempt to really find literary fiction and sort of very literary writing at its kind of core. And last year that looked like sort of 3 sets of books, one for poetry, non-fiction and fiction. In the year before, it was a shortlist of 8 books that were from across various sort of forms. And so it's kind of an interesting one year on year because it kind of just collects books from kind of various places. How it's sort of worked now and kind of in its sort of more recent form has been to have this very much selected by writers, hence the name. And so, I mean, which it always has been, but this is sort of a slightly newer version of doing that, or a slightly more concentrated version, at least in terms of the naming of it. And so what we end up with is these 3 shortlists that are incredibly interesting for non-fiction, fiction and poetry. And I'm going to talk about the fiction one briefly here. These are all books that I've spoken about elsewhere, so I'll do a little sort of run-through version of it. But I'm really excited to read the non-fiction and poetry ones as well. I think all of them have some very, very interesting books in them that are really great shortlists. So let's just talk about the fiction one. So taking these alphabetically, we have Anne Enright with The Wren. And this is a story around a mother and her daughter, and particularly them sort of navigating new sort of aspects of their relationships. And what I thought was really quite profound about this is the way, I mean, Anne Enright is already an incredible writer in so many ways. She just has a real gift in the ways she crafts sentences and narratives, and the ways that people are allowed to talk in a voice that feels incredibly it's kind of both a dialect and also just sort of very idiosyncratic. She's very good at kind of picking up the idiolect of all these characters, and so you're always fairly sure which character's speaking even without her having to tell you. And particularly the kinds of, in this book, she examines how this mother and daughter navigate various aspects of their lives, and particularly this sort of underlying feeling that this mother in many ways understands a lot about her daughter's life from having lived her own life, but also there's just something that's never quite understood between the two of them, and I think it's really beautifully rendered in this book, and I just found it utterly captivating. I think it's a really well done book, and Anne Enright is just one of those authors who, from the few of hers I've read so far, doesn't seem to be able to do much wrong in my mind. I think she's just an incredibly powerful writer, and I can see why this would be up there, particularly from a more writers-oriented prize. Next up, we have Paul Murray with The Bee Sting. Kind of almost like The New Life by Tom Crew. I'm not necessarily sick of talking about this book, but it's noticeable how many prize lists this has ended up on. It's a great book. Without over-egging it, I just think this is a fantastic book. It's a book that really focuses on the breakdown of a family, particularly the breakdown of various aspects of their lives when a few events happen. So not only issues to do with the financial crisis and sort of broader sort of financial themes, but also the ways that the family holds secrets from each other. It's an incredibly funny and readable book in many ways, but it's also incredibly dark and sad and tragic and complicated in many ways as well. I think the real triumph of this book, more than anything, and I've got a longer video talking about all of this in more detail, but I think the real triumph of this book is the ways that it hides details from you as the reader, and suddenly makes you realize that for the entire book you've kind of been on the back foot. You know, you are not discovering these things alongside the writer or the characters. In some ways, the characters are a little bit ahead of you in terms of knowing some details about what truly went on, and there's something really quite beautiful and profound about that. And it's really great to see this book also recognized by other writers, in the sense that I think, as well as being an incredibly readable book, I think there's a lot of intelligence going on beneath the surface of this book as well. And last but not least, we have Zadie Smith with The Fraud. And the core idea behind this book is that this sort of historical fiction novel focuses around a trial at the heart of it. And this trial has a sort of certain level of sort of celebrity attached to it. It's this kind of big public trial. And a few of our characters who we meet fairly early on are involved in the trial in various ways, often as kind of witnesses, often people watching it. And particularly as it's set in the sort of Victorian times, sort of the late 1800s, there's a kind of newness to a court trial taking so much public, so much of the public consciousness, really being a very, very public and big trial. And so this book, I think, is really interesting in so many ways, in the ways that it tells this very kind of funny and very almost Dickensian story. It's sort of full of these slightly wild characters who are all kind of threaded together in this wider narrative. The thing that I find quite interesting about that is Zadie Smith is somebody who, in many interviews, has spoken about how she's really passionate about the history of the English novel, and that kind of shows in this book, where there's a real deference almost to that kind of older style novel from particularly sort of Victorian times. And so, yeah, it's kind of really interesting. What we basically then follow is this woman, Eliza Touche, which is also just an incredibly camp name. I mean, I think it's like, I think it's sort of based on somebody who's real, but it just also feels like it should be a drag queen's name. I don't know. Anyway, I don't make the rules. But the big kind of thing that kind of comes up at the heart of this is this trial about who gets to tell certain sorts of stories and who gets to, sort of be there in various parts of history. And a big part of that history is to do with slavery, is to do with it's many sort of senses, I guess, race and class and a few other these things, even though the trial doesn't always necessarily go that way, but these are all kind of complicating factors in a lot of what's being discussed. And all of it is really to kind of work out who's telling stories in the right way. I think it's a really interestingly done book. She's created this really fun set of characters, and it's so different from a lot of other Zadie Smith novels. I mean, I've only read a couple of others, but from the ones I've read. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see how she's done. I know it didn't kind of land for many people as well as some of her other books, but I still think it's actually a pretty well done book overall, and I really enjoyed it. The audiobook is also really fun if you get a chance, because it is Zadie Smith herself, and she's a far better narrator than I actually thought that she would be as an audiobook reader. It's I don't know what I expected, but she's very, very captivating with it. And so those are our 3 books. It feels weird having a shortlist this short, but I think this is a really economical shortlist with some really good, hard-hitting books. In some ways, a sort of predictable set of authors, in the sense that these are all quite established authors. No debuts, kind of no really like left field ones that you wouldn't have expected in some ways, but I still think a really solid shortlist. I mean, Paul Murray always has my heart on these kinds of The Bee Sting is a book that I really love. I'm just also really delighted to see the Wren get a bit of love. I think The Fraud has sort of been missing on quite a few prize lists, so it's interesting to see it here as well. Yeah, just a fun set of 3 books. I'm going to separately be reading the non-fiction and the poetry. I've got a little bit more to go with those ones. But here's a little stopgap for now with me talking about the fiction. Anyway, take care and speak to you all soon. I hope you are doing really well. Bye-bye.